Welcome. We were actually just taking a look at your profile before we started recording today.
Yeah, really thinking about the specific kinds of things that tend to spark your curiosity.
Exactly, because you have this distinct desire to understand the why behind the media we all consume. You aren't really looking for just, surface level plot recaps.
Right. You want multiple perspectives. You want to dig into the underlying philosophy of a piece.
And you want to do it without feeling completely buried in an avalanche of disconnected information? Well, we built this custom curated deep dive exactly for you.
We really did.
Today, we are turning our attention to a piece of media that is honestly practically unavoidable right now.
Yeah, you really can't escape it.
I'm talking about the newly released January 2026 post-apocalyptic thriller, 28 years later, The Bone Temple.
Directed by Nia DaCosta.
Right, and written by Alex Garland. This is the direct sequel to last year's 28 Years Later, which makes it the fourth installment overall in the entire 28 Days Later franchise.
It is a massive cultural moment.
Mm.
But beyond the box office numbers, it is a deeply philosophical piece of work that really demands analysis.
It definitely does.
So to pull this apart for you today, we have gathered a rather eclectic stack of sources.
Yeah, what are we looking at?
Well, we are using the official Wikipedia plot and production data just to ground us in the objective facts of the film's creation. For the critical consensus, we're looking at reviews from RogerEbert.com, as well as the notoriously discerning Vern's reviews.
Always a tough crowd over there.
Very much so. We are also pulling behind-the-scenes insights from cast and director interviews published in Mashable, Bleeding Cool, and Den of Geek.
Awesome.
And because the lifeblood of a franchise like this really is its audience, we have sourced some incredibly detailed grassroots biological theories directly from the R28 Days Later Reddit community.
I love that we're including the fan theories. The mission for our deep dive today is to explore how this specific film attempts to radically shift the entire infected genre away from standard gritty survivalism. The film uses the literal physical remnants of humanity to pose a rather profound question. Can art, science, and empathy actually serve as a cure for a rage apocalypse?
That's a heavy question.
It really is. Okay, let's unpack this.
To really grasp the narrative shift here, we have to start by looking at the mechanical shift behind the camera. The previous film, which came out in 2025, was directed by Danny Boyle.
The same filmmaker who launched the whole franchise back in 2002.
Exactly. But for this back-to-back sequel, Boyle handed the directorial control over to Nia DaCosta.
Right.
Now, DaCosta has built a reputation on projects like Candyman, Little Woods, and the recent theatrical reimagining Hedda. Stepping into a massive legacy franchise is always a precarious position for a filmmaker,
Oh, for sure. The pressure must be immense.
But DaCosta made a very deliberate pitch to the studios. She was not going to simply mimic Danny Boyle's signature visual language.
And that departure is incredibly stark when you look at the technological choices. I mean, the 2025 film was famously shot entirely on an iPhone 15 Pro.
Yeah, which is wild for a major studio release.
Right. But that choice gave the footage a highly kinetic, frantic, almost punk rock energy because of how small and agile the camera was. DaCosta, however, went in the complete opposite direction.
She brought on cinematographer Sean Bobbitt,
Replacing Anthony Dodmantle, right. And they opted to shoot the Bone Temple on the Arri Alexa 35 digital camera.
which fundamentally changes the psychological effect the images have on the viewer. If you think about an iPhone sensor, it's tiny. It struggles in low light, the digital noise gets messy, and the image stabilization feels frantic when pushed to its limits.
It inherently feels like documentary footage or found footage.
Exactly, which triggers a feeling of immediate panic. The Arri Alexa 35, on the other hand, is a massive top-of-the-line cinema camera with an incredible amount of dynamic range. It captures light, shadow, and color with meticulous precision.
And it's heavy.
Very heavy. It requires heavier rigging, which naturally forces the camera movements to be slower, smoother, and more deliberate. It replaces the feeling of kinetic panic with a feeling of creeping, inescapable dread.
That makes total sense.
As Ralph Fiennes mentioned in one of the promotional interviews, this heavier, deliberate setup allowed DaCosta to utilize much longer, subtler close-ups. It gives the actors the necessary space to develop the intricate, microscopic nuances of a performance, rather than just reacting to the chaos around them.
And that visual stillness seems to be perfectly mirrored in the audio landscape.
Oh, absolutely.
The original films relied heavily on aggressive, pulsing rock and electronic energy to drive the tension. But DaCosta brought in composer Hildur Guðnadóttir for the Bone Temple.
An incredible choice.
Right. Guridotter won an Academy Award for her work on Joker, and she also scored Tar and recently collaborated with DaCosta on Hedda. She builds soundscapes that are more about negative space and low-frequency tension than loud jump scares.
It is a much subtler, far more subdued auditory experience.
Though, for the legacy fans, John Murphy's iconic, blood-pumping track, In the House in a Heartbeat, does eventually make his return over the credits. But choosing a quieter, more philosophical tone for a major horror franchise is a massive financial gamble.
It is a severe risk, and the box office numbers reflect that tension. The film was made on a net budget of $63 million, with TSG Entertainment covering half the production costs.
And Sony reportedly spending an additional $70 million just on marketing.
Right, but the theatrical reception has been soft. Based on the data in our sources, it has grossed $57.9 million worldwide so far.
That's not ideal for a budget that size.
No. Domestically in the United States, industry tracking projected an opening weekend of around 20 to 22 million over the 4-day Martin Luther King Jr. holiday weekend. Instead, it pulled in just 13 million over the traditional 3-day window and an estimated 15 million over the 4-day holiday.
So what does this all mean for the state of the genre? Is it simply a matter of the film being too slow for a holiday weekend audience?
If we connect this to the bigger picture, this is the classic, recurring struggle for legacy horror properties. When a franchise attempts to pivot away from what made it famous, in this case kinetic, bloody action and traditional scares, to focus on slower, philosophical dread, it almost inevitably alienates a large segment of its core audience.
Because they feel like they were promised one thing and given another.
Precisely. You're trying to sell an elevated horror experience to an audience that bought a ticket expecting an adrenaline rush? There are also significant external factors. Severe winter storms across the U.S., severely depressed general theater attendance that weekend.
Can't control the weather?
Exactly. But beyond the weather, there is a cultural factor at play. A commenter named C.J. Holden on Vern's Reviews articulated this perfectly. There is a palpable human monster fatigue in the market right now.
The idea that the humans are the real monsters, not the zombies?
Yes. That trope was revolutionary when 28 Days Later or The Walking Dead did it 2 decades ago. But in 2026, audiences have seen so many iterations of cruel human factions surviving the apocalypse that they might be highly resistant to rushing out for a film whose marketing campaign focuses heavily on a human cult rather than the infected themselves.
It's an interesting tension to consider for yourself as someone consuming this media. When you watch a long-running franchise undergo a radical shift in style, how do you react?
That's a great question to ponder.
Does a cleaner, highly deliberate visual style and a slower pace actually enhance the psychological horror for you by giving you time to sit with the dread? Or do you find yourself missing the messy, chaotic, adrenaline-fueled energy that initially defined the property?
And it's worth noting the critical consensus generally praises DaCosta's execution of this new style, even if it alienated the opening weekend crowd.
Right, but to truly understand what DaCosta is executing, we have to look at the central location of the film and the man who constructed it.
At the thematic core of the film is Dr. Ian Kelson, portrayed by Ralph Fiennes. Kelson is a former general practitioner who has essentially become a physician hermit. He lives in a cramped subterranean bunker powered only by a hand-cranked generator.
Sounds cozy.
Well, it is what sits above the bunker that gives the film its title. Kelson has spent years constructing a towering ossuary, a temple made entirely from thousands of human bones, skulls, femurs, tibiae, and fibulae, all meticulously arranged.
Which is an insane visual.
To any passing survivor, the immediate assumption is that Kelson is deeply insane. He lives isolated in a wasteland swarming with the infected, building monuments out of corpses. Furthermore, his skin is entirely stained a deep, rust-red color.
But the film quickly subverts those initial grotesque assumptions. When the young protagonist, a boy named Spike, stumbles upon Kelson, we learn that the red staining isn't blood or some ritualistic paint. It is an iodine solution. Kelson covers his skin in it as a makeshift, rudimentary protection against contracting the virus through microscopic cuts or abrasions. And the bone temple itself is not a monument to madness or sadism.
No, not at all. Melanie McFarlane wrote a fantastic piece for Salon analyzing Kelson's underlying philosophy. She focuses on a specific line of dialogue where Kelson explains the ossuary to Spike.
What does he say?
Kelson says, every skull is a set of thoughts. These sockets saw, and these jaws spoke and swallowed. This is a monument to them, a temple.
Wow.
He is a strict practitioner of the ancient Stoic philosophy of memento mori, which translates roughly to remember that you must die. Historically, memento mori wasn't about morbid obsession. It was about keeping the inevitability of death in mind to appreciate the profound value of the present life.
So he's building a memorial.
Precisely. Kelson is attempting to preserve human memory and basic dignity in a world that has violently discarded both. Notice that he intermingles the bones of the infected with the bones of the uninfected survivors. In his eyes, the virus stripped away their agency, but death makes them all equal again.
He is treating art and science not as opposing forces, but as intertwined tools for preserving humanity. But here is where the narrative takes a massive leap. Kelson isn't just focused on the dead.
No, he's actively applying this philosophy to the living infected.
This brings us to the character of Samson. Samson is an alpha-infected, a massive, physically imposing leader of a local pack, played by Chai Lewis Perry. And just on a technical level, bringing Samson to the screen was a staggering undertaking.
The behind-the-scenes details on that are incredible.
Lewis Perry had to wear a full-body prosthetic suit. It required a team of 7 makeup artists working for 6 to 8 hours straight just to apply the suit. Because the materials degraded during the intense physical performance, they had to repeat this grueling application process over 25 times throughout the shoot.
Just at an unbelievable level of commitment. The visual result is terrifying, which makes Kelson's interaction with Samson so jarring. Kelson does not shoot Samson with a firearm.
He uses a blowgun, right?
Yes, a specialized blowgun to deliver a meticulously crafted cocktail of morphine, a powerful opioid painkiller, and xylazine, a heavy veterinary sedative. Kelson hypothesizes that the rage virus puts the host in a state of constant, burning neurological agony. By sedating the monster, he is actually providing relief.
And Samson realizes this.
He does. The film shows him deliberately returning to the perimeter of the temple, effectively forming a dependency on the relief Kelson provides.
But wait, let's play devil's advocate here for a second. If we look back at the established lore of the franchise, the infected are supposed to be mindless machines driven only by an overwhelming compulsion to attack uninfected stimuli.
Right.
At the end of the original 2002 film, we literally saw them starving to death in the streets because they didn't have the cognitive function to feed themselves. How does a mindless, starving rage monster survive for 28 years, especially through brutal British winters?
That exact question has torn the fan community apart. If you look at the discussions on the R28 Days Later Reddit community, there is a fierce debate regarding the biological logic of the script. Some users, like OKArmadillo2564, argue that it is a massive plot hole.
Because they should all just be dead.
Exactly. They point out that a naked, starving infected person simply could not survive nearly 3 decades of exposure to the elements without regaining the cognitive ability to seek shelter, make fire, or hunt effectively. But then you have users like DCMF29 who laid out a very compelling defense rooted in natural selection.
The idea that the virus itself had to adapt.
Yes, we have all become very familiar with how rapidly real-world respiratory viruses mutate as they spread through populations. The Reddit theory posits that while 99% of the originally infected likely did starve or freeze to death within the first few months, the remaining 1% survived because they contracted slightly mutated strains of the rage pathogen.
That makes a lot of sense from a biological standpoint.
Another user, Captain Bluetech, expanded on this, noting that a pathogen's primary goal is its own proliferation. If killing the host through starvation prevents proliferation, the pathogen will eventually tune itself.
Over 28 years, Darwinian natural selection would leave only the infected who retained basic, rudimentary survival instincts.
Exactly. The ability to scavenge, drink water, seek basic shelter, and perhaps most importantly, form rudimentary pack structures for warmth and defense, which explains how an alpha like Samson even exists.
It is a brutal vision of evolution. And Kelson's medical intervention yields results that seemingly prove this theory. Because the virus has tuned itself to allow basic survival, there is still a sliver of the original human brain functioning underneath the rage.
Through prolonged sedation and care, Samson experiences a breakthrough. He regains enough cognitive clarity to speak a single word.
Moon.
Moon. The film actually places the camera behind Samson's eyes for a moment. We see what he sees. He experiences a hallucination, or rather a suppressed memory, of a pre-virus life. He is on a commuter train, and he hears a conductor asking for his ticket.
The implication Alex Garland is making with the script is monumental there.
It really is. It suggests the rage virus doesn't just cause mindless anger. It causes profound, agonizing psychotic hallucinations that make the host perceive everything as a threat. By chemically treating the hallucinations, Kelson is literally reaching through the virus to the human trapped underneath.
Which culminates in what might be the most surreal sequence in the franchise. It wasn't even in Garland's original script. Kelson and Samson, the sophisticated aging doctor and this hulking, terrifying rage monster, share a clumsy, drug-induced dance.
It's a beautiful moment.
Kelton plays Duran Duran's Rio in Ordinary World on his hand-cranked record player, and they just sway together. Ralph Fiennes and Shea Lewis Perry completely improvise the moment on set. The juxtaposition is staggering. You have the apocalypse raging outside, and inside, the preservation of an 80s synth-pop memory.
It serves as a profound thesis statement on the utility of art. In a version of the United Kingdom that the rest of the world has quarantined and left to rot, Kelson does not measure survival merely by the number of canned goods he has stockpiled. He survives through a dedication to artistic curiosity. Danny Boyle actually gave an interview to Rolling Stone where he posed the central question of this new trilogy. He asked, "What happens if our culture dies?" Kelson's character is the answer to that. Culture dies unless you actively labor to keep it alive. The work of cranking that generator to play a record is the very action that separates human survival from animal survival.
It forces a fascinating thought experiment. If you were truly the last sane person on Earth, living in an underground bunker surrounded by the ruins of human achievement, what specific pieces of media would you expend physical calories to keep alive?
It's a great question.
What few vinyl records would you choose to power with a hand-cranked generator just to maintain a tether to your own humanity? It's a heavy question about what art actually sustains us. But inevitably in this genre, where there are individuals striving to preserve humanity, there are factions eager to exploit its collapse.
There always are.
This brings us to the primary human antagonists of the narrative. Let's look at weaponized nostalgia, Sir Lord Jimmy Crystal, and his cult, the Fingers.
If Dr. Kelson represents the exhausting labor required to preserve human dignity, Sir Lord Jimmy Crystal represents the absolute degradation of it. Played by Jack O'Connell, Jimmy is an incredibly unsettling antagonist. He leads a sprawling, violent cult known as the Fingers, though the members frequently refer to themselves as the Jimmies.
And the aesthetic of the cult is bizarre, gaudy, and deeply unnerving.
Jimmy himself wears a plush, purple velour tracksuit and a cheap peroxide blonde wig. He demands that every single member of his cult, completely regardless of their original gender or identity, relinquish their name and adopt the moniker Jimmy.
So the cult is populated by characters named Jimmy Ink, Jimmy Shite, Jimmy Fox, Jimmy Snake, and a particularly sadistic enforcer named Jemima.
The real-world inspiration behind Jimmy Crystal is intensely dark, and it requires a level of objective analysis to understand what the filmmakers are attempting to say. According to the cast interviews, Jack O'Connell and Nia DaCosta drew direct, explicit inspiration from the disgraced British entertainer and prolific predator Jimmy Savile.
It is a deeply uncomfortable parallel, but a deliberate one. O'Connell explained that he wanted the character to embody the concept of unchecked power and the horror of fame existing entirely without consequence.
By putting Jimmy Crystal in a purple tracksuit, the costume department is visually suggesting a twisted, perverse parody of royalty or untouchable celebrity status. The film is using the post-apocalyptic setting to craft a commentary on how hierarchical structures and charismatic leaders can normalize and shield monstrous behavior in plain sight.
And the script roots the psychology of Jimmy Crystal's character in early childhood trauma mixed with early childhood media consumption. We are told that Jimmy is the son of a vicar. He survived the initial outbreak in 2002 as a young child. His trauma stems from being locked in a room by his father.
He sat in front of a television watching the late 90s children's show Teletubbies, while just outside the door, the newly infected were violently tearing apart his neighbors and family.
His father, the vicar, viewed the virus not as a pathogen, but as a divine biblical cleansing. Before letting himself be killed by the mob, the father handed young Jimmy an upside-down crucifix.
The psychological result is catastrophic. Jimmy survives, but his mind violently fuses the aesthetic innocence of the Teletubbies with the apocalyptic religious fervor of his father. Teletubbies was fundamentally a show about gentle cooperation, routine, and basic shapes. Jimmy twists those gentle tenets into a dark, authoritarian dogma.
It's so messed up.
For instance, after his cult commits acts of extreme, unspeakable violence, the members will literally chant the Teletubbies catchphrase, again, again.
It is a deeply disturbing juxtaposition.
This raises an important question regarding how catastrophic trauma fractures the human psyche in divergent ways. Both Dr. Kelson and Jimmy Crystal have endured 28 years of uninterrupted psychological terror. Kelson processes the horror by seeking to meticulously clean the bones of the dead, and attempting to chemically reach the humanity trapped inside the infected. He seeks order and healing.
Whereas Jimmy Crystal weaponizes his trauma.
Yes, he adopts the persona of the son of Old Nick, a British colloquialism for Satan, and demands absolute violent submission. He doesn't use the aesthetics of religion and nostalgia to comfort his followers. He uses them to mentally break and control them.
The physical manifestation of that control is shown through the cult's initiation rites, which serve as the primary set pieces of horror in the film's second act. The young protagonist, Spike, is captured by the cult. To earn the mere right to draw breath in their camp, Spike is forced into a gladiatorial death match.
The location they choose for this is highly significant. An empty, disused water park pool. They take a space that was entirely designed for the joy and laughter of children, and they pervert it into a concrete arena for murder.
Spike is forced into a desperate knife fight against a massive cult member named Jimmy Shite.
It forces the audience to watch the corruption of innocence in real time. Spike survives the encounter, but the psychological toll is immense. The film repeats this motif of domestic perversion later when the cult raids an isolated farm.
Right. They capture a survivor named Tom and his pregnant partner, Kathy. Jimmy Crystal offers Tom a place in the hierarchy, but only if he can defeat the enforcer, Jemima, in single combat. The separation devolves rapidly, ending with Tom intentionally igniting a gas tank and burning down the barn to ensure Kathy can escape.
Incinerating himself and several cult members in the process.
The brutality is relentless, but there is a very nuanced psychological dynamic playing out quietly within the ranks of the cult itself, specifically the relationship between Jimmy Crystal and a high-ranking member named Jimmy Inc., played by Erin Kellyman.
The preparation DaCosta required of Kellyman is fascinating. She instructed Kellyman to watch the 2012 documentary The Act of Killing,
which is a remarkably harrowing piece of nonfiction cinema.
In The Act of Killing, real-life Indonesian death squad leaders from the 1960s are asked to enthusiastically reenact their mass killings in the style of various Hollywood genres. DaCosta used this documentary as a psychological textbook for Kellyman. She wanted Kellyman to internalize the bizarre, completely detached mindset of individuals who have participated in so much atrocity that extreme violence becomes as mundane as washing the dishes.
And that detached normalization heavily informs Jimmy Inc.'s relationship with Jimmy Crystal. In an interview with Bleeding Cool, Kellyman explained that Inc. is not just a random follower. She was Crystal's very first recruit. He found her wandering alone when she was only 8 years old.
They share a twisted, decades-long history of survival. Kellyman noted that they barely speak to each other in the film. Their communication is almost entirely nonverbal, relying on prolonged eye contact. It implies a deeply ingrained dynamic of manipulation, mutual dependence, and perhaps a highly warped version of familial love.
Inc. is the only member of the cult who exhibits microscopic fractures in her conditioning. She quietly covers for Spike on several occasions, and the camera lingers on her, actively avoiding participation when the other cult members are engaged in the ritualistic skinning of a survivor.
She recognizes the horror, but the psychological gravity of Jimmy Crystal's orbit is too strong for her to simply walk away.
That toxic orbit is ultimately what pulls the cult directly toward Dr. Kelson. After the disaster at the farm with the barn fire, the cult's numbers are heavily depleted and paranoia is setting in. Jimmy Crystal's grip on power is slipping. In a desperate attempt to offer a new target, Jimmy Inc. suggests they seek out a demon she previously spotted in the deep woods.
She had witnessed Kelson, covered head to toe in his rust-red iodine, interacting calmly with the hulking Samson at the Bone Temple. Because of the cult's warped religious dogma, she genuinely believes she has found Old Nick Satan himself in the flesh.
Jimmy Crystal leads his fractured cult to the ossuary, which sets the stage for the film's climax.
The climax is a brilliant narrative collision between these two opposing philosophies of survival. Jimmy Crystal marches into the Bone Temple and, upon confronting Kelson, quickly realizes that this frail man is a doctor, not a supernatural deity.
However, Jimmy is a cornered autocrat facing a crisis of faith among his followers. He cannot admit he was wrong without losing his absolute authority. So, he pivots.
He issues Kelson a grotesque ultimatum. Kelson must actively pretend to be Satan. He must put on a theatrical performance that validates Jimmy's divine authority to the rest of the cult. If he refuses, Jimmy will have him tortured to death.
Kelson is backed entirely into a corner. He can submit to the degradation of this cult, or he can embrace the theater. And here is where it gets really interesting. This is where the meticulous pacing of the first two acts finally explodes.
Yes, tying directly back to his core philosophy of memento mori.
Exactly. The practice of facing the inevitability of your own death with absolute dignity and intent. Kelson chooses the theater. He decides to transform his sacred ossuary, this quiet monument to the lost, into a spectacularly profane stage.
The execution of this sequence is arguably the centerpiece of the film.
Mhm.
Kelson silently complies with the physical demands. He dons a ragged black leather trench coat. He walks over to his hand-crank generator, flips through his modest collection of vinyl, and utters the line, "Okay, let's turn this one up to 11."
He drops the needle on his record player, and the heavy metal riffs of Iron Maiden's 1982 classic, The Number of the Beast,
Yeah.
shatter the silence of the wasteland.
It is an audacious directorial choice. Nia DaCosta was incredibly candid in her interview with Mashable about the sheer terror she felt when she first read Alex Garland's script for this scene. She admitted she thought to herself, well, this could end my career. If this doesn't work perfectly, it's going to look ridiculous.
But the gamble pays off because of the absolute commitment from Ralph Fiennes and the technical execution by cinematographer Sean Bobbitt. They constructed a god's eye view shot, looking straight down on Kelson as the cult members ignite a massive circle of fire around him.
Fiennes delivers an exhausting, highly physical, pyrotechnic-filled lip-sync performance. He is practically scampering up the mountain of skulls, fully embodying this manic, satanic rock star persona.
But crucially, it isn't just a performance. Kelson uses the chaotic distraction of the heavy metal and the blinding firelight to secretly expose the cult members to a massive dose of weaponized, aerosolized hallucinogens.
Jack O'Connell, who was obviously watching this unfold on set, remarked that seeing a classically trained actor like Ralph Fiennes perform this nearly naked, exhausting dance for hours on end, surrounded by actual rings of fire, was completely mind-blowing.
Thematically, Kelson is using the extreme theatrical pomp and circumstance of 1980s heavy metal to out-crazy a genuine death cult. He is deconstructing their religious terror by turning it into a literal rock concert.
Unfortunately, the narrative demands a tragic resolution to this confrontation. Kelson successfully uses the hypnotic sensory overload of his performance, combined with the hallucinogens, to shatter Jimmy Crystal's psychological hold over the cult. In the peak of the chaos, Kelson commands the awestruck, heavily drugged Fingers to turn on their leader and crucify him.
The cult splinters violently. In the ensuing melee, Jimmy Inc. finally breaks her decades-long conditioning and turns her weapons on her fellow cult members to protect the boy, Spike. But the victory is Pyrrhic. In a final, desperate thrash of violence, Jimmy Crystal manages to close the distance and fatally stab Dr. Kelson in the abdomen.
The aftermath of that violence provides one of the most poignant emotional payoffs in the entire franchise. The fire dies down, Spike is desperately trying to comfort the bleeding doctor, and then, from the tree line, Samson emerges.
The alpha-infected walks into the carnage. Jimmy Crystal, bleeding out and pinned to an inverted cross, looks at the hulking monster and, in his drug-addled state, truly believes Satan has come to claim him.
But Samson doesn't even acknowledge Crystal's existence. He walks right past the man who built an empire on violence. Samson approaches Dr. Kelson, kneels down, and with immense effort, speaks Kelson's name. He thanks him.
The implication is staggering. The virus hasn't just been temporarily sedated. Through continuous chemical and empathetic intervention, the humanity within Samson has genuinely begun to resurface and take control of the host's body.
Samson gently lifts Kelson's lifeless body from the ground and carries him away into the deep woods, leaving Jimmy Crystal alone in the ruins of the temple to eventually be torn apart by a roaming pack of infected.
If you look at the thematic synthesis of that entire sequence, it is incredibly moving. Kelson's ultimate act of memento mori wasn't just accepting his death, it was refusing to let fear dictate his final moments. He faced almost certain execution with theatrical glamour, intellect, and a heavy metal record.
He didn't defeat a violent autocrat with a bigger gun or superior brute strength. He defeated him by using culture, art, and pharmacological science. The film argues, quite forcefully, that human ingenuity and empathy are ultimately far more powerful weapons than mindless fury or authoritarian cruelty.
Which seamlessly transitions us to the very final moments of the film, where Garland and DaCosta lay the thematic groundwork for the future. Spike and Jimmy Inc., who finally sheds her cult moniker and reveals her birth name as Kelly, manage to escape the slaughter at the ossuary. The screen fades to black.
When the image returns, the aesthetic is completely shifted. We are far away from the oppressive, rust-colored dread of the Bone Temple. We open on the interior of a peaceful, highly organized, and isolated farmhouse. And inside this farmhouse, we get a cameo that anchors this entire new trilogy to its roots.
Cillian Murphy makes his return. He appears in a completely uncredited cameo, reprising his role as Jim, the bicycle courier, who woke up from a coma in the very first hospital scene in the original 2002 28 Days Later. Now, Murphy has been working behind the scenes as an executive producer on these new films, but physically placing him back on the screen provides an immense sense of grounding for the audience.
We find Jim sitting quietly at a desk with his teenage daughter, Sam. They aren't cleaning weapons or boarding up windows. They are engaged in a homeschooling lesson. Specifically, they are studying the geopolitical history of post-World War II Europe.
And wait, let's really dig into this, because why would Alex Garland choose that specific historical era for the final scene of a zombie film?
What's fascinating here is the precise historical parallel Jim is drawing for his daughter.
Yeah.
Jim is actively quizzing Sam on the catastrophic dangers of bankrupting and systematically destroying the loser of a major conflict. He is walking her through the aftermath of World War I.
He explains how the victorious Allied powers imposed the Treaty of Versailles.
Yes, which placed incredibly harsh, punitive economic reparations on a defeated Germany. He explains how cornering a defeated enemy, stripping them of their dignity, and collapsing their economy led directly to the desperation of the Weimar Republic. That profound national desperation created a fertile breeding ground for fascism, which inevitably caused the infinitely more destructive World War II.
He is giving her a lesson in macro empathy.
Exactly. Or, more accurately, structural pragmatism. Jim is explicitly explaining that if you want a lasting peace, it is critically important to help rebuild your enemy once the immediate threat is neutralized, rather than merely attempting to annihilate them out of vengeance or fear.
That is a brilliant piece of screenwriting because it perfectly mirrors the exact work Dr. Kelson was doing at the Bone Temple. Kelson wasn't trying to exterminate Samson and the infected, he was trying to rehabilitate them. And here, miles away, Jim is teaching the next generation that the only way to genuinely rebuild human society is through structural support and forgiveness, rather than endless cycles of warfare and eradication.
The scene culminates when Jim and Sam look through their binoculars out the farmhouse window. They spot Spike and Kelly exhausted, running desperately across a field, being pursued by a small pack of infected.
Sam looks at her father and asks if they should risk their safety to intervene and help these strangers. Jim does not hesitate for a fraction of a second. He confirms that they must. They grab their gear and head out the door, and right at that moment, John Murphy's classic driving guitar riff from the 28 Days Later theme music finally kicks in.
It is an incredibly satisfying note to end on. It sets a clear trajectory for the third film in this trilogy, which, according to the production news, Danny Boyle is actually slated to return to direct. It teases a future narrative where the human survivors are no longer content to simply hide behind concrete walls. They are going to actively attempt to reintegrate and rebuild the world, potentially alongside the very people who were previously lost to the rage virus.
It is a fundamentally optimistic conclusion to a deeply grueling journey. It really leaves you, the listener, with a substantial question to chew on. In a world that has been entirely defined and destroyed by rage, is the capacity for forgiveness actually the ultimate, most highly evolved survival tool we possess? It's a massive concept to carry with you out of the theater.
So, to summarize the rather incredible thematic terrain we've navigated today, we began by analyzing a daring shift in directorial style, exploring how Nia DaCosta traded the kinetic, rolling shutter panic of the previous film for the meticulous, creeping dread of a cinema-grade lens.
We ventured underground to an isolated bunker built of human bones, where a stoic doctor used pharmacological science in Duran Duran to reach the trapped, hallucinating soul of a rage monster.
We examined the deeply uncomfortable, real-world inspirations behind a cult that weaponized early childhood nostalgia to inflict authoritarian pain.
We witnessed a heavy metal exorcism illuminated by real fire. And finally, we ended on a quiet, hopeful note in an isolated farmhouse, where the franchise's original survivor is teaching his daughter the historical and practical necessity of extending grace to your enemy.
It is a dense, incredibly layered piece of filmmaking that clearly respects its audience enough to tackle massive sociological concepts without spoon-feeding the answers.
And speaking of leaving things open to interpretation, we always like to leave you with one final, provocative thought to mull over long after this deep dive ends.
Consider the implications of the physical artifacts left behind in the film. Kelson's Bone Temple physically demonstrated that human bones will long outlast our individual lives and memories, and that Iron Maiden vinyl record proved that our recorded art has the potential to outlast the rise and fall of our civilizations.
But if we follow the Reddit theory of viral natural selection to its logical conclusion, What happens when the rage virus continues to tune itself? What happens when the infected slowly regain full cognitive function, but the human society they once knew is completely gone?
Will the next major leap in human evolution not be driven by a sterile synthesized cure in a medical syringe, but by the infected, literally rediscovering their own humanity by sifting through the physical ruins of our culture? Could the key to saving the world be the very art we are creating right now?
That is a truly profound avenue to explore on your own. Thank you so much for joining us on this custom deep dive into 28 years later, the Bone Temple. We hope this thorough unpacking of the visual, historical, and biological themes enriched your understanding of the film and sparked some entirely new ideas. Keep exploring the media you love, keep asking the difficult questions, and whatever you do, always keep your favorite record safe. Until next time.